Hey guys, tonight, we're setting aside the stories of powerful emperors, fearless generals, and glittering triumphs, because history wasn't built only by the famous. It was also built by countless ordinary people, men, women, and children, whose names have long been forgotten. Imagine waking before sunrise in ancient Rome. The streets are still quiet. The air is cool. Somewhere in the distance, a baker is already lighting his oven. A merchant is preparing his stall. A soldier is finishing a long night watch. And thousands of workers are beginning another exhausting day, knowing that the hardest part of it has not even begun. Some of these jobs were dirty. Some were dangerous. Some were painfully exhausting. And a few were so miserable that most people today would refuse to do them for even a single hour. Tonight, we'll slowly wander through the crowded streets, smoky workshops, noisy docks, dark mines, public baths, and even the foul underground sewers of the Roman Empire, discovering what everyday life was really like for the workers who kept one of history's greatest civilizations alive. But before we begin, if you enjoy these relaxing history stories, and they help you unwind after a long day, I'd really appreciate it if you'd take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps more people discover these peaceful journeys through history. And I'd love to hear from you as well. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see just how far these bedtime history stories travel around the world. Now, dim the lights, settle comfortably into your favorite chair, or under a warm blanket, take one slow, gentle breath, and allow the busy world outside to slowly drift away. Our journey begins nearly 2,000 years ago, in the mighty city of Rome, where the empire's most miserable jobs were quietly waiting for another ordinary day. The first thing you might notice is the silence, not complete silence, of course. Rome was rarely truly quiet. Even before dawn, the great city was beginning to stir. Somewhere behind a closed wooden door, footsteps crossed a stone floor. A cartwheel creaked against uneven paving. From a distant alley came the low murmur of voices, followed by the soft clatter of someone preparing tools for the day ahead. The city was waking slowly, and with it came the workers. For the wealthy, morning might begin behind the walls of a comfortable house, with servants preparing food and tending to every small need. But for many others, the beginning of a new day meant something very different. It meant work. Some would spend their hours carrying heavy loads through narrow streets. Others would descend into places where sunlight barely reached. There were men who breathed dust beneath the earth, workers who stood for hours beside furnaces, and people whose hands were permanently stained by the trades they performed. Then there were those whose work was hidden entirely, beneath the marble temples, beneath the busy markets, beneath the elegant homes of Rome's richest citizens. The empire depended on labor that few people wanted to see. The city needed clean water, it needed roads, it needed bread, it needed buildings, baths, ships, clothing, food, and countless other necessities, and every necessity had a human cost. This is perhaps the strangest thing about Rome. The grander the empire became, the more invisible its workers could seem. A senator might admire a magnificent road without thinking about the exhausted hands that built it. A wealthy Roman might relax in a warm bath without wondering who had carried the fuel, cleaned the rooms, or maintained the furnaces. History remembers the monuments, but monuments do not build themselves. So, as the first pale light touches the rooftops, let us leave the grand avenues behind. Let us step away from the statues and temples, and follow the quieter paths toward the places where ordinary workers began their days. Somewhere beneath our feet, another world is waiting, a world of dark tunnels, narrow passages, cold stone, and unpleasant smells, and there, hidden beneath the magnificent city of Rome, the first workers of our journey are already beginning their morning. The darkness beneath the city can wait for a little while. Before we follow the workers into the places where daylight disappears, we should first return to the surface, to the beginning of another ordinary morning in Rome. The sky is still pale when the city starts to breathe, a faint gray light settles over the rooftops. The last stars are disappearing above the hills, and the streets, which only a few hours earlier had been filled with footsteps and voices, are slowly beginning to stir again. For some Romans, the morning begins comfortably. Inside a wealthy home, servants move quietly through spacious rooms. Oil lamps flicker against painted walls. Water is carried in heavy vessels. Food is prepared. Somewhere in the courtyard, a fountain makes a soft, continuous sound, but most people do not wake surrounded by such comfort. For the ordinary worker, morning is much less peaceful. Imagine sleeping in a cramped apartment building, high above the street. The room is small. The walls are close. There may be several people sharing the same space, each trying to find enough room to lie down. The air is warm and stale, especially after a night spent with little ventilation. There is no alarm clock, no gentle music, no promise that the day ahead will be easy. Instead, the first sounds of morning come from outside. A door opens somewhere below, a wooden shutter is pushed aside. A donkey begins to bray, then another sound joins them, the unmistakable creaking of a cart moving over Roman paving stones. Slowly, the city wakes, a worker opens his eyes. For a moment, perhaps, he remains still. The room is dark, and the morning air is cool against his face. He knows exactly what waits for him. There is no mystery about the work itself. He has done it yesterday, and the day before that, and tomorrow, if he is fortunate, he will do it again. This was one of the quiet burdens of working life in Rome. The empire was enormous, but for most laborious, their world could be surprisingly small. A few streets, a workshop, a market, a dock, a farm, perhaps a mine far beyond the city. Their lives were connected to Rome's greatness. But they rarely experienced that greatness in the way historians remember it. They did not see the empire from the balconies of senators. They felt it through their hands, a heavy basket, a wooden handle, a rope pulled tight, a stone lifted from the ground, a furnace that had to remain hot. The city depended on such things. As the sun begins to rise, the streets become busier. Workers emerge from doorways carrying the simple equipment of their trades. Some walk quickly, hoping to reach their workplace before the streets become crowded. Others move slowly, conserving their strength for the long hours ahead. The smell of Rome changes with the morning. Smoke rises from ovens. Animals leave their traces in the streets. Food sellers begin preparing their stalls. The scent of bread drifts between buildings, mixing with dust. Damp stone, cooking fires, and the countless smells of a city that has no modern system to hide them. And somewhere among all of this, the first laborers are already at work. A man lifts a heavy load. A woman carries water. A boy follows an older worker, learning a trade he may spend his entire life performing. For some, the work is tiring. For others, it is dangerous. And for a smaller number, the work takes them into places that most Romans would prefer never to visit. The sun climbs higher, the streets brighten, and yet, beneath the noise of the waking city, there is another world entirely, far below the feet of merchants and senators. A network of tunnels carries away what Rome no longer wants: waste, water, The unwanted remains of daily life, the great city above can remain beautiful because someone must deal with everything beneath it. Soon, we will follow those workers downward. They will not be greeted by marble statues or golden temples. Their workplace will be narrow, dark, wet, and foul. They will enter the hidden machinery of the empire, a place where the air itself seems to belong to another world. But for now, the morning continues. The city stretches awake beneath the growing sunlight, unaware of how many invisible hands are already keeping it alive. And as Rome begins another day of noise and movement, beneath the stones, the darkness is waiting. Beneath the waking streets of Rome, the morning light cannot reach. The city above is beginning to fill with footsteps, voices, and the rumble of wooden carts. Shopkeepers are lifting shutters. Bakers are pulling warm loaves from their ovens. Wealthy Romans are beginning their day behind painted walls and quiet courtyards. But underneath all of this, there is another Rome, a darker Rome, a Rome of dripping stone, narrow passages, stagnant water, and shadows that seem to stretch forever. This is where some of the empire's least enviable workers spent their days, the people who cleaned and maintained Rome's drainage systems. To understand their work, imagine standing beside one of the great channels that carried water away from the city. The Romans were remarkably skilled engineers. Their aqueducts brought fresh water across enormous distances. Their roads connected distant provinces. Their sewers helped control the waste and runoff produced by a city that had grown to an extraordinary size. But engineering could not make the unpleasant parts disappear. Someone still had to enter those underground spaces. Someone had to clear blockages. Someone had to remove accumulated debris. And someone had to repair the channels when the system stopped working properly. That someone was usually a laborer with very little choice about where his working day would take him. The entrance might be hidden beneath an ordinary street. From above, there was nothing remarkable about it. People would pass by without thinking. A merchant might walk over the same stones on his way to the market. A child might run past. A senator's carriage might roll nearby, and beneath their feet, a worker could be climbing down into darkness. The first thing he would notice was the smell. There was no escaping it. The underground channels collected the unwanted remains of a crowded city. Wastewater flowed through the passages, carrying dirt and refuse away from the streets above. Rainwater could pour into the system after storms, changing the conditions within minutes. The worker carried little more than basic tools and perhaps a lamp. The light would be weak, a small flame flickering against wet stone. Every step had to be taken carefully. The floor could be slippery, and the passageways were not always spacious. In some places, a worker might be able to stand upright. In others, he could find himself bending low, squeezing through cramped sections where the walls seemed to close around him. There was also the constant uncertainty. A blockage might be simple, or it might not. A sudden rush of water could arrive after heavy rain. Loose masonry could collapse. The air could become difficult to breathe in enclosed spaces. The work demanded patience as much as strength. A laborer might spend hours clearing away material that had collected over time, knowing that the same task would eventually need to be performed again. There was no applause when the work was finished. No crowd gathered to admire a clean sewer. No poet would celebrate the man who removed the obstruction that allowed a street above to remain dry. The reward was simply that nothing happened. The drains worked, the water moved, the city continued. And perhaps that was the strange dignity of such labor. The success of the worker was measured by his absence from public attention. When everything functioned, nobody thought about him. Only when something failed did people notice, and even then, they were unlikely to wonder who had been responsible for fixing it. the underground workers of Rome belonged to a vast world of necessary labor that existed just outside the attention of history. Their names have mostly vanished, their faces are unknown. We do not know what they thought about while they worked in the darkness, or what they dreamed about when they finally climbed back toward the sunlight. Perhaps they imagined a different occupation. Perhaps they hoped their children would find easier work, or perhaps, after enough years, the darkness simply became familiar. That may be the most unsettling part. Human beings can become accustomed to almost anything, even to places that others cannot bear to enter. But the sewers were only one part of Rome's hidden labor. Beyond the city walls, far from the fountains and temples, another group of workers faced a different kind of darkness. Their workplace was not beneath the streets, it was beneath the earth itself. There, in the mines scattered across the empire, men descended into shafts where the sun disappeared behind them, and the walls around them seemed to grow closer with every step. The saw cleaners had worked below Rome. Now, our journey will take us much farther down, into the mines. The sunlight feels different when you have been underground for too long. For the saw worker, returning to the surface meant stepping back into the ordinary world. The sky was above him again. The air moved freely. Even the noise of Rome, with all its carts and voices, might have sounded strangely comforting, but for another group of Roman laborers, there was no quick return to daylight. Their working lives were spent beneath the earth. Across the enormous Roman Empire, mines produced the materials that made Roman power possible. Gold and silver for coins, iron for tools and weapons, copper for everyday objects, lead for pipes and countless other uses. The empire needed these resources. And somewhere below the ground, people had to bring them out. Imagine standing at the entrance of a Roman mine early in the morning. The landscape around you is quiet. Perhaps there are hills covered with scrub and scattered trees. Perhaps smoke rises from furnaces in the distance. The ground is marked by piles of broken rock, wooden structures, and narrow paths worn smooth by countless footsteps. Then you see the workers. They are not walking toward a beautiful city. They are walking toward a hole in the earth. Some mines were relatively open, with workers cutting into hillsides. Others reached deep underground through shafts and tunnels. The deeper the miners went, the more difficult their world became. There was little room. The air grew warmer, the light disappeared, and every piece of material had to be removed by human effort. A miner might carry a basket filled with broken stone, climbing slowly toward the surface. Another worker might swing a hammer against rock, striking again and again in the dim light. The sound would echo through the tunnels. A dull crack, then silence, then another blow. The work was repetitive, but never completely safe. Ancient miners faced falling rocks, unstable tunnels, flooding, and the constant danger of being trapped underground. Fire could be used to weaken certain types of rock, but this created smoke and heat in places where fresh air was already scarce. Imagine spending hours breathing that air, the walls around you, the darkness above, the weight of the mountain pressing silently from every direction, and then imagine doing it again tomorrow. Some people entered the mines because they were enslaved. Others may have been prisoners or condemned laborers. There were also free workers who earned money through mining, especially in regions where the industry offered employment. But regardless of how someone arrived there, the physical reality could be harsh. The mine did not care who you were. It demanded strength from everyone. One of the most exhausting tasks was simply moving rock. The valuable material might be buried deep within ordinary stone. meaning workers could spend an entire day breaking apart huge quantities of useless rock to find a small amount of something precious. A Roman citizen might one day hold a gold coin in his hand and admire its shining surface. He might never wonder where the gold came from. He would not see the miner who had carried it from the darkness. He would not hear the hammer striking the stone. He would not feel the dust settling on the worker's skin. The distance between the finished object and the person who created it could be enormous, and perhaps that distance made the labor easier to forget. There was another strange feature of mining. The deeper the workers went, the more the surface world became something distant. Above them were trees, clouds, birds, and sunlight. Below, only rock. The passage of time could become difficult to sense. A worker might measure his day by the number of baskets carried, the number of stones broken, or the moment when someone finally announced that the shift was over. Then came the climb back. Slowly, tired bodies moved upward, step by step, toward the faint glow of daylight, and when they finally emerged, the world above might seem almost impossibly beautiful. The open sky, the wind, the warmth of the sun, even the ordinary sounds of life. For a few moments, perhaps, the miner could forget the darkness, but the next morning would come, and once again, the earth would open beneath his feet. Yet not every Roman laborer worked on solid ground. Far from the mines, another kind of worker spent his life surrounded by water. His workplace stretched beyond the horizon, and his working day was measured not by tunnels or baskets of stone, but by the relentless rhythm of oars. Soon, we will leave the mountains behind and follow the empire's ships out toward the endless sea. The sea has a way of making a person feel small, even beneath the warm Mediterranean sun. With the horizon stretching endlessly in every direction, the water can seem like another kind of prison. For some Roman workers, the mine was darkness beneath the earth. For others, the darkness was behind them. Their world was a wooden ship, a narrow bench, and an oar that seemed to grow heavier with every passing hour. The Roman Empire depended on ships. Grain had to travel from distant provinces to feed enormous cities. Soldiers and supplies moved across the Mediterranean. Merchants carried wine, olive oil, pottery, metals, and countless other goods between ports, and beneath many of these vessels there were rowers. The popular image of an ancient galley often makes the work look almost romantic. A long wooden ship gliding across blue water, sails catching the wind, oars rising and falling together. But for the people sitting at those oars, the experience could be anything but peaceful. Imagine waking on a ship before sunrise. There is no comfortable bedroom waiting for you. You are already surrounded by the vessel itself, by rough timber, ropes, cargo, and the constant smell of salt water. Depending on the ship and the circumstances, rowers could have very little personal space. You sit where you are told to sit, you hold the oar placed in front of you, and you wait. The sea moves gently beneath the hull. For a moment, everything is quiet. Then comes the signal. The oars begin to move, one after another. Pull, return, pull, return. The motion must be coordinated. If one person moves too early or too late, the rhythm breaks. The strength of many bodies must become one repeated movement. Hours can pass this way. The sun rises, the heat increases, salt gathers on the skin, the wooden handle rubs against the hands. The same motion continues. There is something strangely hypnotic about such work. The endless repetition could make time feel almost unreal. A rower might look toward the horizon and see nothing but water, no familiar street, no home, no changing landscape, only sea. The conditions depended greatly on the type of vessel and the status of the rowers. Ancient ships were not all powered by forced labor. And not every person at an oar was a slave. Some rowers were paid workers, while others could be prisoners or enslaved people. But for those who were forced into the work, the loss of freedom was perhaps the heaviest burden. The sea itself became a workplace they could not leave. A person could dream about walking away from a mine. He could imagine leaving a workshop, but the rower was surrounded by water. Even when the ship reached a harbor, the journey might simply begin again somewhere else. There were also moments when the calm sea disappeared. Storms could transform the Mediterranean without warning. The sky darkened, the wind strengthened, waves struck the hull, and suddenly, the gentle rhythm of rowing became a desperate struggle against nature. But most days were not dramatic, and perhaps that was what made the work so exhausting. The greatest hardship was often repetition, the same bench, the same oar, the same movement, day after day. The Roman world could appear incredibly beautiful from the shore. Travelers might stand beside a harbor and watch ships arriving beneath a golden sunset. They might admire the vessels and imagine adventure beyond the horizon. They would not necessarily think about the people below deck, the men whose backs had carried the rhythm of the journey, the workers whose labor had helped bring distant grain into the city, the rowers who made the empire's enormous network of trade and transport possible. Their work was hidden by the beauty of the sea, and yet, occasionally, a rower might look up. Perhaps the sun would be low, the water would turn silver, the wind would soften, for one brief moment. The oar could rest, and the person holding it might remember that the world was larger than the ship. There were distant shores, there were cities he had never seen, there were fields beyond the horizon. But then the signal would come again, the oars would rise, and the rhythm would return, pull, return, pull, return, and somewhere far away, another Roman worker was beginning a different kind of endless motion, not across the sea, but inside a building where enormous stones turned without mercy. There, the empire's grain would be transformed into flour, and the workers who fed Rome would soon discover that even the simplest loaf of bread could begin with a very difficult morning. The sea slowly disappears behind us, and the sound of water is replaced by something heavier, a deep, steady grinding, stone against stone, round and round, without pause. In the Roman world, bread was more than food. It was part of daily survival, and in a city as enormous as Rome, enormous quantities of grain had to be processed before they could ever become loaves. Somewhere behind the markets, beside bakeries, or within large agricultural estates, mills were turning, and beside those mills, people were working. The Roman mill could be a surprisingly impressive machine. Donkeys or horses might walk in circles to turn heavy stones, while in some regions, water-powered mills eventually used the force of flowing rivers. But not every mill relied on animals or flowing water. Some of the hardest work was performed directly by human beings, enslaved workers. Imagine entering one of these places early in the morning. The air is already thick with dust, grain is piled in sacks, the floor is covered with tiny pieces of husk and flour, and every movement sends another faint cloud drifting through the room. The machinery is simple by modern standards, but the stones are enormous. They must turn, and they must keep turning. A worker's day could be measured by that motion, round and round and round again. If the work depended on human strength, the body itself became part of the machine. A person might push a heavy handle, another might carry sacks, someone else might feed grain into the mill. The tasks were different, but the result was always the same: more grain, more flour, more bread for the people of Rome. For an enslaved worker, there was a particular cruelty in this kind of labor. The work was repetitive, physically demanding, and difficult to escape. There was no question of deciding that you had worked enough for one day. You belonged to someone else, your time belonged to someone else, even your body could be treated as part of the property of the household or business that controlled you. This did not mean that every enslaved person experienced exactly the same conditions. The Roman world was enormous, and the lives of enslaved people varied greatly. Some worked in households. Others were trained in skilled professions. Some were treated with relative kindness, while others endured severe punishment. The mill workers, however, belonged to one of the harsher worlds of labor. Their work was visible in their bodies, flour settled into their hair, dust clung to their skin, the noise of the machinery followed them throughout the day, and because the millstones had to continue turning, the work rarely felt finished. There was always another sack, another batch, another rotation. The sound itself must have become impossible to ignore. A low grinding, a wooden creak, the rhythm of footsteps, the occasional call from another worker. Then the grinding again. For someone standing outside, the mill might seem almost peaceful, but inside, time moved differently. The worker did not think about the entire empire. He thought about the task immediately in front of him. Lift, carry, pour, push, repeat. Perhaps, during a brief pause, he could look toward the doorway and see sunlight falling across the ground. That small patch of brightness might become strangely precious. Outside, Rome continued to live. People bought bread, families sat down to eat, children tore pieces from warm loaves. The finished product was simple, ordinary, and essential. But behind that simple loaf was a chain of labor stretching across the empire. Farmers grew the grain, workers transported it, mill workers crushed it, bakers shaped it, and finally, someone ate it. The people at the end of this chain rarely knew. The people at the beginning, a wealthy Roman might enjoy fresh bread at breakfast without ever imagining the enslaved person who had spent the morning turning the mill. That was one of the quiet mysteries of ancient cities. Comfort often depended on labor that remained invisible, and the mill was not the only place where Rome's necessities were produced under unpleasant conditions. There were workshops where another essential material was created: leather, shoes, belts, harnesses, military equipment, everyday objects. But before animal hides could become useful, they had to pass through a process that filled the surrounding air with some of the most unpleasant smells imaginable. The people who worked there could not simply open a window and walk away. They lived with the smell, they worked in it, and soon, our journey will enter the Roman tanneries, where water, chemicals, animal hides, and human endurance came together in one of the empire's most unpleasant trades. The smell reaches you before the workshop comes into view. It drifts through the narrow streets, carried gently by the warm Roman air. You might notice it near a stream, or beside a drainage channel. Perhaps it hangs around the edge of a neighborhood where few wealthy citizens would choose to live. This is where the tanners work, and among the many trades of ancient Rome, this was one of the hardest to escape from, because the smell followed them everywhere. Leather was essential to Roman life. Shoes protected the feet of soldiers and travelers. Belts held clothing in place. Harnesses helped control animals. Leather containers carried goods across roads and seas. Military equipment depended on it. Almost everywhere you looked, some part of Roman life required treated animal hide. But before raw hide could become useful leather, someone had to perform the unpleasant work of transforming it, and that process began with something most people would rather avoid: animal skins. Imagine arriving at a Roman tannery early in the morning. The first thing you notice is the ground. It is wet. The area around the workshop may be muddy, stained by years of work and constantly exposed to water. Large containers stand nearby. Wooden frames hold stretched hides. Workers move back and forth, carrying heavy skins from one stage of the process to another. There is little elegance here. The work is practical, necessary, and deeply unpleasant. The raw hides first had to be cleaned and prepared. Hair, flesh, and unwanted material had to be removed before the skin could be transformed into something durable. This meant long hours of physical labor. A worker might stand beside a large vat, handling hides that were heavy, wet, and difficult to move. The process required soaking and treating the material, often using substances that helped preserve it. Some Roman tanners used plant materials rich in tannins, while other stages involved different chemicals and mixtures. The details varied, but the basic reality remained the same. The workers' hands were constantly exposed to water, raw animal material, and harsh substances. There was no protective equipment like we would recognize today, no modern gloves, no specialized masks, no carefully controlled industrial environment. The worker simply had to continue. The smell became part of life. It settled into clothing, it clung to hair, it followed workers home. A tanner could leave the workshop at sunset, wash as best he could, and still carry the memory of the workplace with him. Perhaps neighbors knew where he worked without asking, perhaps people stepped aside when he passed. The trade was useful, but it was not necessarily admired. That was one of the strange contradictions of Roman society. Everyone needed leather, few people wanted to. Think about how it was produced. The same society that valued clean clothing and polished sandals depended on workers who handled the raw materials nobody else wanted, and there was another danger. The work itself was physically demanding. Wet hides were heavy, large skins had to be moved, stretched, scraped, and treated. A worker might spend hours standing in one position, bending repeatedly, or lifting materials that became even heavier when soaked. The body absorbed the cost. Hands became rough, clothing became worn, feet remained wet for long periods, and the workday seemed to stretch endlessly. Yet the tannery was also a place where the Roman world revealed one of its most important truths: civilization has a hidden side. The polished sandal on a wealthy citizen's foot had a beginning. The leather harness on a horse had a beginning. The military equipment carried by soldiers had a beginning. Before these objects became symbols of Roman order and power, they passed through workshops like these, through water, through mud, through unpleasant smells, through the hands of people whose names history never recorded. And then, as evening approached, the tanners could finally begin to leave. The light would soften, the workshop would become quieter. Perhaps the smell would linger in the air long after the workers had gone, but somewhere else in the city, another group was already preparing for the day. Their workplace was warmer. Their labor was connected to something every Roman needed: bread. Before most citizens had even opened their eyes, the bakers were already awake. Their ovens were being heated. Their hands were covered in flour, and while the city still slept, they were preparing breakfast for an empire. Soon, we will follow them into the darkness before dawn, and discover why even the smell of fresh bread could begin with exhaustion. Long before the markets become crowded, before the merchants begin calling out their prices, before the streets fill with the sound of carts and footsteps, there is already a warm glow in the darkness. It comes from the ovens. In ancient Rome, the baker's day begins while much of the city is still asleep. The streets outside are quiet, and the sky above the rooftops remains dark. A few stars may still be visible between the buildings. Somewhere in the distance, a night watchman is finishing his final hours of duty, but inside the bakery, the work has already begun. A baker wakes in the coldest part of the morning, often long before sunrise. There is no gentle beginning to the day. The first task is preparation. Grain must be measured, water must be brought, fire must be started, the oven must be heated, and the dough must eventually be mixed. Every loaf that will appear in the markets later that morning begins with these quiet preparations. Imagine stepping into the bakery. The air is cool near the entrance, but warmer closer to the oven. The smell of grain fills the room. A worker lifts a heavy sack. Another begins preparing the dough. Flour settles across wooden surfaces, onto clothing, and into the air. Then comes the kneading. The dough must be worked repeatedly, pressed and folded until it reaches the right consistency. It is not a task that looks difficult from a distance. But after hours of repetition, the weight begins to matter. The hands become tired, the shoulders ache, the back begins to complain, and still, there is more dough waiting. Baking in the Roman world was not simply a small household activity. In a great city like Rome, professional bakeries became increasingly important. The population needed an enormous amount of food, and bread was among the most basic necessities. For the baker, this created a strange kind of pressure. People expected bread every day, not tomorrow, not when convenient, today. If the oven failed, if the grain supply was delayed, or if something went wrong during preparation, the consequences could reach far beyond the bakery. The work had to continue, even when the baker was tired. Even when the weather was unpleasant, even when the previous day had already taken everything out of him. The oven itself was another challenge. Keeping a large oven at the correct temperature required experience. Too cool, and the bread would not bake properly. Too hot, and the outside could burn before the inside was ready. The baker had to understand the fire. He had to watch it, feed it, control it, and work around its heat. During the hottest parts of the day, standing near the oven must have been uncomfortable, but the hardest hours came before sunrise. The baker had already been awake for a long time by the moment ordinary Romans began opening their shutters, and that was the strange irony of the trade. The better the baker did his job, the less people thought about him. They simply woke up and found bread. A warm loaf might appear on a table. A customer might purchase it from a stall. A family might share it during a meal. The baker disappeared behind the finished product. Nobody looked at a loaf and imagined the hours of preparation that had come before it. The hands covered in flour, the heavy sacks, the hot oven, the early morning darkness, and for those who worked under someone else's authority, there was an additional burden. The bakery did not stop because a worker was exhausted. The demand for bread remained. The dough had to be prepared, the ovens had to be maintained, the shelves had to be filled, and the cycle began again the following morning. Still, there were moments of quiet satisfaction. Perhaps a baker could stand outside for a few minutes after sunrise. The first light would touch the rooftops, the city would slowly awaken, and from inside the bakery came the scent of freshly baked bread. For a moment, the exhaustion might feel worthwhile, because the baker knew something important. His work would feed people. His hands had helped create something that would be carried into homes throughout the city. But Rome needed more than food. It needed roads. Thousands of miles of roads connected its cities, farms, ports, and military settlements. Those roads did not appear by themselves. They were built by people who lifted stone, cleared earth, drained marshes, and worked beneath the open sky. Their labor could last for months or even years, and once the road was finished, the people who built it simply moved on, leaving behind a path that would outlive them. Soon, we will leave the warmth of the bakery and walk beneath the open Roman sky, toward the roads that stretched across the empire, and toward the workers whose footsteps disappeared beneath the endless traffic of history. The smell of fresh bread slowly fades behind us, and the streets begin to stretch outward, beyond the crowded neighborhoods of Rome. Beyond the markets and temples, roads lead toward distant hills, farms, ports, and cities whose names may be hundreds of miles away. Somewhere along one of these roads, a group of workers is already awake. There is no bakery here and no warm oven, no shelter from the weather, only earth, stone, tools, and a long road that has not yet been finished. The Roman Empire was famous for its roads. They connected distant regions and allowed people, goods, messages, and armies to travel across enormous distances. Some roads survived for centuries, and traces of Roman engineering can still be found today. But when we admire a Roman road, it is easy to forget the people who built it. The road begins with the ground. Workers must first clear the route, trees are cut down, brush is removed, uneven earth is dug away. In some places, the ground must be drained. In others, hills have to be cut through, slopes reshaped, all low areas filled. The landscape itself becomes something to be conquered by patience. Imagine a worker standing beneath the morning sun. He holds a simple tool. The ground in front of him is hard. He strikes it again and again. The work is not dramatic, it is slow. That is what makes it exhausting. A road can take months or years to complete, depending on its size and the landscape it crosses. And the worker sees very little of the finished result. He sees the small section directly in front of him, the next stone, the next patch of earth, the next load that must be carried. Roman road construction could involve many different kinds of labor. Skilled surveyors planned routes and measured distances, while laborers performed the heavy physical work of excavation, transporting materials, and construction. Large stones had to be moved, layers of material had to be placed carefully, drainage systems were created to help water flow away from the road, the surface had to be made durable enough to withstand years of traffic. The process required organization. But organization did not make the labor easy. A worker carrying stone under the summer sun would feel the weight with every step. The worker digging earth after rain would struggle through mud. A worker building in colder regions would face wind and uncomfortable temperatures. The road did not care about the season. It had to be finished. Perhaps the strangest thing about this work was its relationship with time. The workers were building something designed to last much longer than their own lives. A man might spend years helping construct a road that his grandchildren would one day travel. He might never see the road completed. He might never know how many travelers would eventually walk across the stones he had placed. A merchant could pass along the finished road carrying valuable goods. A traveler could stop beside a milestone and rest. A messenger could ride quickly toward a distant destination. None of them would necessarily think about the labor beneath their feet. The workers had become part of the road, invisible, permanent, forgotten. There was also something strangely peaceful about working in such a landscape, away from the noise of Rome. The sounds could be simple: the strike of a hammer, the scrape of a shovel, the shifting of stone, the footsteps of workers moving slowly across the earth, birds calling from nearby trees, wind passing through grass. For a moment, the work might almost resemble a rhythm, but the body knew better. At the end of the day, muscles were tired, hands were sore, clothing was covered in dust, and the next morning, the unfinished road was still waiting. Perhaps one worker occasionally imagined where the road would eventually lead: a distant city, a sea he had never seen, a place where people spoke differently. The road promised movement, but the workers themselves were often tied to the same small section of land for months at a time. They built freedom of movement for others, while having very little freedom themselves. And once the road was complete, they would disappear from the story. Travelers would arrive, carts would pass, the empire would move, the stones would remain. Yet not every worker in Rome built roads for the living. Some performed a duty connected to death itself. In the shadows of Roman justice, there were people whose profession carried a particular burden. They were executioners, and the assistants who worked beside them. Their labor was feared, their names were rarely celebrated, and their work placed them at the uncomfortable boundary between law, punishment, and death. Soon, our journey will become quieter, the road will end, and we will enter a world where the work itself was considered so unpleasant that even those who performed it could remain apart from ordinary society. The road stretches into the distance, and for a while, the sound of workers fades behind us. The countryside grows quieter, the air is cooler, but somewhere beyond the peaceful hills, another kind of work is waiting, a profession connected not to building, but to punishment. In ancient Rome, the law could be severe. The empire governed millions of people across different lands, and punishments varied according to the crime, the period, the location, and the social status of the person being judged. Some punishments were financial, some involved exile, others could be far more serious, and when the sentence required an execution, someone had to carry it out. This was the work of the executioner. It is easy to imagine such a person as a powerful figure, standing confidently above everyone else, but the reality was more complicated. The executioner occupied an uncomfortable place in Roman society. His work was necessary to the justice system, yet the profession itself could carry a heavy social stigma. People might avoid him, his presence could make others uneasy. The same society that required his services might still consider him undesirable. This created a strange contradiction. The executioner represented the authority of the law, but he was rarely welcomed into respectable society, and he was not always alone, depending on the punishment and circumstances. Assistants might be needed. They could prepare the location, carry equipment, secure the condemned person, help with practical tasks before and after the sentence. These helpers may have been people with little social power themselves. For them, the work was not necessarily about personal belief. It was employment, a duty, a task that had to be completed. Imagine arriving at a place of execution early in the morning. The surroundings are quiet. The ground is empty. A few officials are present. The executioner and his assistants prepare without unnecessary conversation. There is no excitement in the air, only a heavy stillness. The people involved know what is about to happen. The condemned person knows. The officials know. The workers know. And for those performing the task, there is little room for emotion. The work must be done. Then it is over. The executioner may leave. The assistants may clean the area and return to their ordinary lives, but the memory of the profession could follow them. Ancient Roman society placed great importance on status and reputation. People were not simply judged by what they did, but also by the kind of work they performed. Some occupations were respected, others were considered degrading. The executioner belonged to the latter category. This was not necessarily because Romans believed punishment itself was unnecessary. Quite the opposite. The state relied upon punishment. But the person who carried out the punishment could become socially isolated because he was constantly associated with death. It was as though society needed him, but did not want to stand too close to him. Perhaps this explains why such workers are difficult to find in historical records. The powerful leave inscriptions, the wealthy leave monuments, generals leave names carved into stone. But the people who performed society's least comfortable duties often disappeared almost completely. The executioner's assistant could live an entire life without leaving a recognizable mark on history, and yet, his work was part of the machinery of the empire. Without people willing, or forced, to perform such tasks, the legal system could not function in the way authorities expected. This was one of the uncomfortable truths of Roman civilization. Every system requires someone to perform Its unpleasant duties: someone must carry away waste, someone must work beneath the earth, someone must process raw materials, and someone must stand at the edge of the law and carry out its final decisions. But after the work was finished, there was no celebration. The executioner did not return to a cheering crowd, his assistants did not receive medals, they simply went home. Perhaps they passed through the same streets as everyone else, perhaps they bought food in the same markets, perhaps they tried to remain unnoticed, and life continued. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, a completely different kind of labor was already underway. The public baths were filling, water was flowing, fires were burning beneath enormous furnaces. Wealthy citizens and ordinary Romans would soon arrive to relax, talk, exercise, and wash. For visitors, the baths could feel luxurious; for the workers who kept them running, they were a place of heat, noise, and constant labor. Behind the warm rooms and beautiful decorations, someone had to feed the fires, someone had to carry fuel, someone had to clean, and someone had to keep the great Roman bathing machine alive. Soon, we will step behind the walls of the baths and discover the workers who made relaxation possible for everyone else. The executioner disappears into the quiet streets, and the sound of his footsteps is soon replaced by something very different: water, the gentle splash of a fountain, the distant murmur of conversation, the echo of voices beneath high ceilings. We have arrived at the Roman baths. To many Romans, the public bath was a place of comfort, a place to wash, to exercise, to meet friends, to talk about business, politics, gossip, and the endless details of daily life. Some bath complexes were enormous, almost like small cities within the city itself. They contain pools of different temperatures, exercise areas, gardens, changing rooms, and rooms decorated with marble and mosaics. For the visitor, the experience could be luxurious, but behind all of that comfort was a workforce that most bathers probably never considered. Someone had to make the baths function, someone had to keep the water moving, someone had to heat the rooms, someone had to maintain the fires, and someone had to clean the place after thousands of people had passed through. The work began long before the first visitors arrived. Deep beneath the bathing complex, the furnaces were already burning. The heating system used by the Romans, known as a hypercaust, allowed hot air to circulate beneath floors and through certain wall spaces. It was an ingenious system. But ingenuity did not eliminate the labor required to keep it running. Workers had to feed the furnaces, and furnaces consumed fuel, wood had to be gathered, transported, stored, and burned. Imagine spending your working day near those fires. The air is hot, the walls are warm, smoke and dust fill the spaces around you. The temperature can become uncomfortable, especially when the outside weather is already warm. The worker's task is simple in theory: keep the fire burning, but simple does not mean easy. The fire cannot be ignored. If it becomes too weak, the baths cool. If it becomes too strong, the temperature may become excessive. The workers must constantly monitor the heat. Add fuel, move fuel, clear ash, repeat, and above them, the bathers relax. They sit in warm water. They talk, they laugh, they perhaps complain about the weather or discuss the latest news. Very few think about the person beneath the floor, the worker who is sweating so that everyone else can enjoy the heat. This contrast must have been extraordinary. In one part of the building, people were trying to cool themselves. In another, workers were struggling with enormous furnaces. The bath was a place where social boundaries could become complicated. People from different backgrounds might meet there, but the workers who maintained the building often remained in the background. They were necessary, but invisible. The cleaning itself was another task. Thousands of people could pass through a large bath complex. Water needed attention, floors became dirty, rooms needed sweeping, waste had to be removed, surfaces had to be scrubbed. The larger the bath, the more constant the work. A worker could clean one area in the morning and find it dirty again by afternoon. There was no final moment when the job was truly finished. The building simply continued operating, and so did the labor. Perhaps one of the strangest experiences for these workers was hearing the laughter above them. Imagine carrying fuel through a dark service passage. You hear voices through the walls. People are enjoying themselves. You know they are relaxing because of the heat you have helped create, but you cannot join them. Your job is to keep working. There was also the physical strain, carrying wood, lifting heavy containers, working in heat, standing for long periods, moving through narrow service areas. The work could be exhausting even when the public rooms looked beautiful, and yet, without these workers, the famous Roman baths could not exist. The marble required labor, the water required labor, the heating required labor, the cleanliness required labor. Even relaxation had a workforce behind it. As evening approached, the crowds would gradually disappear, the voices became quieter, the pools emptied, the magnificent rooms fell into silence, but the workers were not necessarily finished. The fires still needed attention, the rooms still needed cleaning. The next morning would come quickly, and before the first visitors returned, the whole process would begin again. Somewhere within this enormous world of Roman labor was another profession connected to entertainment: the people who trained gladiators. Behind the arena's spectacle, away from the roar of the crowd, trainers worked with men who were expected to fight for their lives. Their world was different from the baths. There was no peaceful water, no quiet relaxation. Instead, there were training yards, wooden weapons, discipline, and constant preparation. And behind the famous arena, someone had to prepare the fighters. Soon, we will step away from the public spectacle and into the quieter world behind it. The baths grow quiet, the last voices fade beneath the marble arches, and the warm pools settle into stillness. But somewhere else in the city, another kind of preparation is taking place. Behind the great arenas of Rome, away from the crowds and the excitement, men are training. There are no cheering spectators here, no trumpets, no magnificent costumes, only the sound of wooden weapons striking against shields, and the steady footsteps of people who know that their lives may depend on what they learn. The gladiator trainer lived in a strange world. He was not necessarily a gladiator himself. Some trainers had once fought in the arena and survived long enough to teach others. They understood the techniques of combat, the discipline required to remain calm, and the terrible reality of what awaited inside the amphitheater. Their knowledge had value, but their work could still be exhausting. Imagine arriving at a gladiator training school before the morning sun has fully risen. The training yard is quiet, the ground is packed earth, wooden practice weapons lie against a wall, shields rest nearby, the fighters are beginning to gather. Some are enslaved, some are prisoners, others may have entered the profession voluntarily, attracted by money, fame, or the possibility of gaining a better life. Their backgrounds are different, but once training begins, the work becomes the same again and again. The trainer watches, he corrects a stance, adjusts the position of a shield, demonstrates a movement, then makes the fighter repeat it. The same action may be practiced dozens of times, perhaps hundreds. A gladiator cannot afford to think too slowly. Inside the arena, hesitation could be fatal. The trainer's responsibility is therefore enormous. He is not simply teaching someone how to fight. He is preparing a human being for a world where mistakes have consequences that cannot be undone. This created an unusual relationship between trainer and fighter. The trainer might be strict, he might be demanding, but his knowledge could also keep someone alive. Every correction mattered, every lesson had a purpose, the work required constant attention. A trainer could not simply stand in the corner and watch, he had to study each fighter. Some were strong, some were quick, some had natural confidence, others were frightened. A good trainer needed to understand their differences. He had to know when to push someone harder and when to stop. The training itself could be physically demanding. Trainers demonstrated techniques, they moved through exercises, they carried equipment. They spent hours standing beneath the sun, and they worked around injuries. A training school was not a place where people simply became stronger, it was a place where bodies were constantly tested, bruises were ordinary, muscles became sore. Old injuries could return. A trainer had to decide when an injury was serious enough to require rest. The future of the fighter, and perhaps the financial interests of those who owned him, could depend upon that decision. This was one of the uncomfortable realities of gladiatorial training. The fighters were human beings, but they could also be treated as investments. Their owners had an economic interest in keeping them healthy enough to perform. A skilled gladiator could be valuable, a famous one could become extremely valuable, so the trainer's work was connected to money as much as survival. Behind every famous arena performance was a long period of preparation. The crowd saw the final moment. The trainer saw everything that came before, the mistakes, the exhaustion, the repetition, the fear, or perhaps, occasionally, he saw a fighter realize that he had finally mastered something difficult. A movement that once seemed impossible suddenly became natural. The trainer might nod, then move on. There was always something else to learn. By afternoon, the training yard would be hot, dust would rise from the ground, the wooden weapons would become worn, and the exercises would continue. Then, as evening approached, the fighters would leave the yard. The trainer might remain behind. He would inspect the equipment, think about the next day's training, consider which fighters were ready, which needed more work, which were injured, which might soon enter the arena. The work never truly ended with the last exercise. The arena was always waiting, and so was the next morning. But beyond the training grounds, there were people whose entire lives revolved around serving someone else. They did not train for public applause. They did not prepare for combat. Their workplace was a wealthy Roman household. There, servants and enslaved people performed hundreds of small tasks that allowed their masters to live comfortably. Some cooked, some cleaned, some carried messages, some cared for children, others stood nearby, waiting to be summoned. Their work could be quieter than that of a gladiator trainer, but in some ways, it could be even more difficult, because they were never truly off-duty, and in the homes of the wealthy, privacy itself could become a luxury that belonged almost entirely to the people being served. The training yard falls silent, the wooden swords are put away, the shields lean against the walls, and the last light of evening settles over the ancient stones. But while gladiators prepare for a life beneath the gaze of thousands, another group of people works behind walls that most outsiders rarely see. The homes of the wealthy. From the street, these houses can appear peaceful, tall entrances, painted walls, courtyards filled with sunlight, fountains murmuring beneath the shade. Perhaps a visitor might imagine that such a household runs effortlessly, but nothing about it happens by itself. Every meal, every clean room, every prepared garment, every message delivered, every guest welcomed, every child watched over, requires someone to work, and in many wealthy Roman households, much of that work was performed by enslaved people. Their lives could vary enormously. Some were cooks, some were cleaners, some cared for children, Others served at meals, managed household supplies, worked in gardens, or performed skilled tasks. A large household could contain many people, each with a specific responsibility. Imagine waking inside such a home. The wealthy owner is still asleep, but the household worker is already awake. There is no need for the master to call. The day begins because there is work to be done. A servant enters the courtyard. Water must be carried, floors must be cleaned, clothing must be prepared, food must be arranged. The smallest details of another person's life become your responsibility, and the work can change without warning. Perhaps a guest arrives unexpectedly, perhaps someone wants a different meal, perhaps a child needs attention, perhaps a master decides to leave the house. The worker must adapt. There is little room for saying, "I am tired." The household continues. This was one of the peculiar burdens of domestic slavery. Unlike workers who left a workshop at sunset, household slaves could remain close to their masters throughout the day. Their workplace was also their living environment. There was often no clear separation between labor and rest. A person might finish one task, only to wait for the next. And waiting itself could be part of the job. A servant might stand nearby during a meal, a messenger might wait in an entrance hall, a personal attendant might remain close to the person they served. They had to be ready, always. The wealthy could enjoy privacy because someone else was constantly present. A door was opened by someone, a bath was prepared by someone, a bed was arranged by someone, a meal arrived because someone carried it. Even silence could require labor, and perhaps this is why the life of a household slave was so difficult to define. Some tasks were physically exhausting, others were emotionally demanding. A worker might be expected to remain cheerful while feeling completely powerless. They might serve a family for years. They could watch children grow up. They might know the habits, fears, and secrets of the people they served, yet they remained socially vulnerable. Their position depended upon the household. For some enslaved people, there were possibilities of freedom. Manumission did occur in Roman society, and some enslaved people could eventually become freed persons, but freedom was never guaranteed, and until that moment came, the worker remained under another person's control. The contrast between master and servant could be especially visible during a Roman banquet. Imagine a wealthy dining room. Guests recline comfortably, food is served, wine is poured, conversation flows, music may fill the room, and around the edges, servants move quietly. They carry dishes, refill cups, remove plates, anticipate requests. The guests may barely notice them. That invisibility was part of the service. The ideal servant was one who seemed to disappear, but behind every movement was a human being, someone with memories, someone with hopes. Someone who might dream about a different life. Perhaps, late at night, after the household had finally become quiet, a servant could find a few moments alone. The courtyard might be empty, the fountain might still be flowing, the lamps might be burning low. For a short while, there were no instructions, no footsteps approaching, no voice calling their name, just silence. Then morning would come again, and the household would wake. Yet not everyone who worked for Rome's wealthy citizen stayed in one place. Some workers moved constantly. They carried letters across mountains. They crossed rivers. They traveled along dangerous roads. They were the messengers of the empire. Their work connected people who might never meet, and sometimes the message they carried was more important than their own lives. The courtyard is silent now. The fountain continues its quiet rhythm, and somewhere behind the walls of the wealthy household, people sleep without knowing how many workers have already begun another day. But beyond the city, someone is walking. He has a message, and the message cannot wait. The Roman Empire was enormous. Its territory stretched across mountains, deserts, forests, and seas. News that began in one distant province might need to reach a governor hundreds of miles away. Military commanders needed information. Officials exchanged letters. Merchants sent instructions. Families separated by distance waited for word from relatives, and all of this required people who could carry information from one place to another. Messengers, at first glance, their work might seem less miserable than mining or saw cleaning. There was no furnace, no underground tunnel, no heavy millstone, but distance itself could become a burden. A messenger's workplace was the road, and the road never ended. Imagine leaving a Roman settlement just before sunrise. You carry a small bag, inside may be letters, official documents, or sealed messages. The contents are important. But the messenger may not know exactly what they contain. His task is simple: deliver them. He begins walking, or, if circumstances allow, he may travel by horse or another form of transport. The road stretches ahead. At first, the journey may feel manageable. The morning is cool, the countryside is quiet, birds move through the trees, but after several hours, the body begins to notice the distance, feet become sore, the sun grows hotter, the road continues. A messenger cannot simply decide that he has had enough. The message must arrive, and every mile remaining is another mile to travel. Roman roads made communication across the empire more efficient than it might otherwise have been. Official systems could use established routes and relay stations, allowing authorized travelers to change horses or obtain supplies. But even with these advantages, travel was not effortless. Roads crossed difficult terrain, rivers had to be passed, weather could change, and not every journey was predictable. A messenger traveling alone could also feel the loneliness of distance. The familiar world disappears behind him. The people he knows are far away. Ahead is another town, another road, another horizon. Perhaps he reaches a small roadside station as evening approaches. He stops. The horse is cared for, food is eaten, a few hours of rest, then sleep, and before long, the journey begins again. For some messengers, speed was the most important thing. A message about a political crisis could not move slowly. Military information could be urgent. An official order might have to reach its destination quickly. The messenger therefore carried more than paper. He carried responsibility. If he became delayed, someone might become impatient. If the message was lost, the consequences could be serious. If he arrived too late, the information might no longer matter. This created a strange kind of pressure. The messenger himself was often forgotten. People remembered the news. They remembered the decision that followed. They remembered the battle, the appointment, the order, or the announcement, but few remembered the person who had walked the road to deliver it. He was simply the connection between two distant points, and perhaps that was his greatest burden, to spend his life moving between places without truly belonging to any of them. Yet there could also be moments of unexpected beauty. Imagine traveling along a Roman road at dawn. Mist lies across the fields. The sun begins to rise behind distant hills. The road is quiet. The messenger pauses for a moment. He looks back. The town he left has disappeared behind the landscape. The road continues toward another place he may never have seen before. For one brief moment, the journey is peaceful. Then he remembers the message and continues, step after step, mile after mile, across the empire. But not every worker traveled during the day. Some were responsible for protecting the streets after darkness fell. While most people slept, these workers remained awake. They walked through neighborhoods where fires could break out. They watched for thieves. They responded to disturbances. They guarded the fragile peace of the night. They were the night watchmen of Rome, and their working day began precisely when everyone else's was ending. The messenger finally reaches the roadside station, and as evening settles over the distant hills, the road becomes quiet. But in Rome itself, the darkness is only beginning. The city changes after sunset. During the day, Rome belongs to merchants, laborers, travelers, children, and crowds moving through narrow streets. At night, many of those people disappear behind closed doors. Shutters are pulled across windows, doors are locked. Lamps begin to glow behind walls, and the streets become strangely different. This is when the night watchmen begin their work. Their duty was to remain awake while much of the city slept. They watched the streets, they responded to fires. They dealt with disturbances, and in some circumstances, they helped maintain order during the dangerous hours after dark. For a worker assigned to the night, the day began when everyone else's day was ending. Imagine preparing for a shift as the sun disappears. The sky above Rome turns orange. The last sunlight touches the tops of temples and apartment buildings. Markets are closing. Shopkeepers are carrying their goods indoors. The streets are slowly becoming quieter, but the watchman is only getting started. He gathers whatever equipment he needs, then he steps outside. The first hours of the night may seem peaceful. A few travelers are still moving through the streets. Some taverns remain open. Voices drift from behind wooden doors. Oil lamps flicker beside entrances. But as the hours pass, the city becomes quieter. The watchman's footsteps become easier to hear. Perhaps he walks through a narrow alley, then turns onto a wider street. He pauses, listens, nothing. He continues. The job requires patience. Most nights may pass without a serious incident, but the worker cannot assume that nothing will happen. Rome was a city of fire. Buildings were often close together. Many were constructed with materials that could burn. Cooking fires were everywhere. Oil lamps provided light. A single accident could become a serious problem, so the watchman's greatest enemy might not be a criminal. It might be a flame. Imagine seeing smoke rising in the darkness. At first, it is difficult to tell how serious the situation is. Then comes the glow, a fire. The watchman must respond. People are awakened, neighbors shout. Water is carried. Orders are given. The calm night disappears. The watchman's work suddenly becomes urgent, but for most of his shift, the city remains quiet, and this creates another kind of difficulty, sleepiness. The human body naturally wants to rest during the night. The watchman cannot. He must remain alert while everyone around him is becoming tired. His work is measured in hours when the rest of the city is dreaming. Perhaps he walks beneath a moonlit sky. The ancient buildings rise around him. The streets are empty. A fountain can be heard somewhere nearby. A dog moves through the shadows. The watchman keeps walking. There is something almost peaceful about the scene, but beneath that peace is responsibility. If something goes wrong, someone must notice. If a fire begins, someone must raise the alarm. If trouble appears, someone must respond, and that person may be the only one awake. The night could also feel lonely. The watchman might pass houses where families are sleeping. He might see warm light through a window, hear quiet voices behind a door, then continue walking. He is close to thousands of people, and yet completely separate from them. By the early morning hours, exhaustion begins to settle into the body. The streets are still dark. The watchman's eyes are tired. His feet ache from walking, but his shift is not finished. Then, slowly, the horizon begins to change. A faint light appears. The city starts to wake. Bakers begin preparing their ovens. Merchants stir. Workers step into the streets, and the watchman's long night is finally coming to an end. He returns home while others begin their day. Perhaps he passes a baker carrying flour. The two workers move in opposite directions. One is finishing, the other is beginning, and somewhere beyond the city walls, an even larger group of workers has already been awake for hours. Farmers. Their work feeds everyone, the wealthy, the poor, the soldiers, the merchants, the workers, even the night watchman. Before Rome can eat its bread, someone must grow the grain. Before the markets open, someone must harvest the crops. And before the empire's enormous cities can survive, someone must work the land. So our journey leaves the sleeping streets behind. We follow the road into the countryside, toward fields that stretch beneath the open sky. There, the work is older than Rome itself, and the people who perform it are tied to the rhythm of seasons, weather, and soil. Soon, we will meet the farmers who carried the empire on their backs, even when nobody knew their names. The night watchman walks home, and behind him, Rome begins to wake. The streets slowly fill again, doors open, ovens glow, carts begin to move. But before the first merchant arranges his goods, before the first baker shapes his dough, and before the first household prepares its morning meal, there is the land, beyond the crowded cities and stone roads. Fields stretch beneath the open sky. Here, the rhythm of life is different. There are no marble columns, no public baths, no busy markets, only soil, wind, sunlight, and the endless work of growing food. The Roman Empire depended upon its farmers. Every loaf of bread began with grain grown somewhere in a field. Every amphora of olive oil began with trees planted in the earth. Every cup of wine began with vines carefully cultivated through changing seasons. The empire could build roads across mountains. It could construct enormous cities. But without farmers, none of it could continue. And farming was rarely gentle work. Imagine waking before sunrise on a Roman farm. The air is cool. The fields are still covered in darkness. There is no need to wonder what the day will bring. The work is already waiting. A farmer steps outside. The soil must be prepared, animals must be fed, tools must be checked, water must be carried. And if the harvest season has arrived, there will be no time to waste. The work follows the seasons. In spring, the earth must be prepared, seeds must be planted. During summer, crops need attention. Then comes harvest, and harvest can be especially demanding. Imagine standing in a field beneath the Roman sun. The heat grows stronger. The plants must be cut, bundles gathered, grain separated. The work continues hour after hour. There is little shade. The body becomes tired. Hands become rough, dust settles on the skin. But the harvest cannot wait forever. A storm could destroy crops. Drought could weaken them. Insects could damage them. A poor harvest could affect an entire household. For farmers who worked land owned by others, the pressure could be even greater. Some agricultural laborers were enslaved. Others were tenant farmers who cultivated land under agreements with landowners. Their circumstances varied widely, but the uncertainty of farming remained. The farmer could work tirelessly and still lose everything to weather. That was perhaps one of the most difficult truths about agricultural life. Effort did not guarantee success. You could wake before sunrise, work until sunset, do everything correctly, and still watch the sky turn dark with clouds. A storm could arrive, rain might fall too heavily, or not at all. The Roman farmer lived with forces he could not control. And yet, there was a quiet beauty to this life as well. The fields changed with the seasons. After months of work, the first signs of growth appeared. Green shoots emerged from the soil, vines became heavy with grapes, olive trees carried their fruit, wheat fields moved gently in the wind. For a farmer, these changes were not simply beautiful, they were survival. A successful harvest meant food, it meant income, it meant another year might be possible. The empire's cities depended upon this. Rome itself could not feed its enormous population from the land immediately surrounding the city. Grain traveled long distances, ships crossed the Mediterranean, carts moved along Roman roads, warehouses stored supplies, and behind all of it, there were fields, there were farmers, there were hands pressing seeds into soil. The people who ate the food often had no idea who grew it. A wealthy Roman might enjoy a meal in a beautiful dining room. A soldier might receive a ration far from home. A baker might turn grain into bread before dawn. All of them were connected to the farmer, yet the farmer remained distant from the final product. His work disappeared into the empire. The land gave, the worker gave. And Rome consumed. As evening approached, the farmer finally sets down his tool. The fields become quiet. The day's heat begins to fade. Perhaps he looks across the land and sees the result of months of work. There is no monument, no inscription, just the earth. And tomorrow, the work begins again. But the food grown in these fields does not remain in the countryside. It moves toward cities, toward markets, toward ports, and at those ports, another group of workers waits. They lift, carry, load, unload, again and again. They are the market porters and dock workers, the people who keep Rome's goods moving from one place to another. Their work may seem ordinary, but without them, the empire's enormous network of trade would simply stop. The farmer stands quietly at the edge of the field, and the last light of day settles over the land he has worked for so long. But the grain will not remain there. Soon, it will be carried away, loaded onto carts, moved along roads, taken toward the coast, and eventually placed aboard ships bound for distant ports. The Roman Empire was connected by an enormous movement of goods, grain, olive oil or wine, timber, stone, ceramics, spices, cloth. Thousands of different objects traveled from one place to another, but goods do not move themselves. Behind every shipment was a person who lifted it, carried it, dragged it, loaded it, unloaded it, and carried it again. These were the market porters and dock workers. Their work could begin before the sun appeared. In a busy Roman port, the morning might start with the sound of ropes tightening, wooden carts rolling across stone, voices calling instructions, animals pulling heavy loads, and the dull impact of cargo being placed onto the ground. The port was a place of constant movement. Ships arrived, ships departed, goods came in, goods went out. And the workers had to keep everything moving. Imagine standing beside a large ship. Its hull rises above you. The vessel has traveled across the Mediterranean. Inside are amphorae filled with oil or wine, sacks of grain, wooden containers, perhaps luxury goods from distant provinces. The ship has finally arrived. Now the unloading begins. A worker approaches the cargo. He lifts. The weight settles into his arms. He carries it across the dock, then returns again and again. The work is repetitive. But the weight never becomes lighter. A single container may be manageable, hundreds are not. The worker's body becomes part of the transportation system. His shoulders, his back, his hands, his feet, every part is used, and every part becomes tired. The docks could also be dangerous. Heavy cargo could fall, ropes could snap, wooden surfaces could become slippery. A worker might lose his balance near the water. There was little room for carelessness, yet the work could not simply stop. A ship waiting in port cost money. Cargo had to be moved. The faster the work was completed, the sooner the vessel could continue its journey. This created pressure on the workers. The port was always connected to time. Every delay affected someone else. A merchant waited, a ship owner waited, a buyer waited. And somewhere in the chain, the porter was expected to keep moving. In the markets, the work took a different form. A market porter might carry goods from a cart to a stall, or from a warehouse to a shop, or from one part of the market to another. He might carry baskets of vegetables, heavy jars, sacks of grain, bundles of cloth. The variety of goods changed constantly. The labor did not lift, carry, set down, return, lift again. The market itself could be noisy. Merchants called to customers, animals moved through the streets, people argued over prices, children ran between stalls, and through all of this, the porters navigated carefully with heavy loads. A man carrying a large basket could barely see over it. He had to trust the people around him to move aside. Sometimes they did, sometimes they did not. The worker's body had to adapt. He learned how to balance weight, how to move through narrow spaces, how to carry more efficiently. Experience became strength. But even experienced workers eventually became tired. Perhaps the most difficult part was that the work was often invisible. A customer purchased an amphora of oil. He thought about the oil, not the person who carried it. A merchant sold grain. He thought about the price, not the worker who unloaded the ship. The empire celebrated trade. It celebrated wealth. It celebrated the abundance that arrived from distant lands. But the workers who physically moved those goods were rarely remembered. Their labor disappeared into the economy, just as quickly as their footsteps disappeared into the crowded streets, and yet, the port was one of the places where the empire became visible. A person could stand on the dock and look around. Goods from different regions were gathered together, languages mixed, ships came from distant shores, people arrived with unfamiliar clothing and accents. The port connected worlds, but the worker standing beneath the cargo felt the connection differently. For him, the empire was not an abstract idea. It was weight, it was rope, it was wood, it was sweat, and it was another load waiting nearby. As the sun began to disappear, the port slowly became quieter. The ships remained, the warehouses remained, the cargo remained, but eventually, the workers went home. Tomorrow, the same goods would need to move, and somewhere beyond the docks, countless others were performing equally exhausting tasks. Some worked in workshops, some cleaned streets, some processed materials, some carried water, some performed jobs so ordinary that history never thought to record their names. They were the empire's forgotten laborers, and without them, the great machine of Rome could never have moved at all. The harbor grows quiet, the ships rest against their moorings, the last workers carry their final loads toward the warehouses, and the noise of the market slowly disappears into the evening, but Rome is still moving. Somewhere, a street is being swept, somewhere else, a cart is being repaired, a worker is carrying water, another is washing clothing, someone is repairing a roof, someone is cleaning a public latrine. Someone is collecting waste before it becomes a problem for everyone else. These people rarely appear in the stories told about Rome. They are not emperors, they are not generals, they do not stand beneath marble arches while historians record their names. They are simply workers, and there were countless of them. The Roman Empire was enormous, and its daily life depended upon an endless collection of small tasks. Some jobs were dirty, some were exhausting, some were dangerous, others were simply repetitive, the kind of work that could make one day feel exactly like the day before it, and the day after. Consider the people who worked with clothing. A Roman garment might look beautiful when worn by a wealthy citizen, clean, bright, carefully arranged, but before it reached that person, someone had to wash it. Cloth could be treated with substances that helped remove dirt, but the process was not pleasant. Workers in fulling establishments cleaned and processed textiles, preparing them for use. The finished clothing might be valuable, the work behind it could be uncomfortable. Then there were those who repaired buildings. Rome was constantly under construction. Walls needed maintenance. Roofs required repair. Streets became damaged. Stone surfaces wore down. A worker could spend his entire life repairing things that other people simply assumed would always exist. There were also people who worked with animals. Stable workers, handlers, people who cleaned animal areas and prepared food. Their work was not glamorous, but without them, transportation and agriculture would suffer. Everywhere you looked, there were people performing tasks that made other people's lives easier, and yet, the better they did their jobs, the less visible their work became. A clean street attracts little attention, a functioning sewer is almost never discussed, a repaired roof is noticed only when it begins to leak, a full market is admired. The person who carried every basket there is forgotten. This is perhaps one of the strangest things about history. We tend to remember the things that were built, not always the people who maintained them. We remember Rome's monuments, but someone cleaned them. We remember its roads, someone repaired them. We remember its armies, someone supplied them. We remember its cities, someone carried the water. The empire was not held together by famous people alone. It depended upon ordinary workers whose lives rarely reached the written record. Some may have been free, some were enslaved, some were immigrants from distant provinces, some were born into the communities where they worked. Their circumstances varied, but they shared one thing. Their labor was necessary. Perhaps the most difficult part was the lack of recognition. Imagine working for years on a task that no one notices. You repair a wall, someone else walks past it. You clean a street, someone else complains that it is dirty again tomorrow. You carry supplies into a building, someone else uses them without wondering how they arrived. Your work disappears as soon as it is finished. Then you begin again. This kind of labor can feel endless. There is no grand moment when the empire thanks you, no statue, no celebration, no inscription carved into stone, just another morning, another task, another day. And yet, there is something quietly powerful about these forgotten lives. They remind us that history is not only made by those whose names survive. A civilization is also made by people who leave almost no trace. The person who swept the floor, the woman who carried water, the man who unloaded a ship, the worker who repaired a broken tool, the child who helped with a family trade. Their names may be gone, but their labor remains. It remains in the roads, in the buildings, in the food that reached the markets, in the water that flowed through the cities, in the clothes worn by ordinary people, in the very survival of Rome. Perhaps that is why these forgotten workers deserve our attention. Not because their lives were extraordinary, but because they were ordinary. They experienced tiredness, hunger, cold, heat, hope, fear, and perhaps, like people everywhere, they also had moments of happiness, a conversation with a friend, a shared meal, a quiet evening, a laugh that no historian recorded. These small moments are lost to us, but they were real, and as the evening deepens, our journey through the workers of Rome begins to turn toward another question: if so, many people worked so hard. What did they receive in return? What was their labor worth? Who became wealthy? Who remained poor? And could a miserable job ever provide enough money to change someone's life? To understand the true burden of these occupations, we must finally look at the question of payment, because a job is not only measured by how difficult it is also measured by what a worker receives after giving away his time, his strength, and sometimes his health. And in Rome, the answer was rarely simple. The evening settles over Rome, and for a moment, the streets seem almost peaceful. The workers we have followed throughout this journey have disappeared into the darkness, The farmer has returned from the fields, the dock worker has left the harbor, the night watchman has finished his shift, the baker is resting before another early morning, the household servant waits for the next command, and somewhere, far from the noise of the city, a miner may still be working beneath the earth. All of them gave something to Rome: their time, their strength, their health, sometimes their freedom. But what did they receive in return? The answer is difficult because there was no single Roman wage. Pay depended on the occupation, the location, the period, a worker's skill, and, perhaps most importantly, whether the worker was free or enslaved. For enslaved people, the question of wages was entirely different. They were legally owned by someone else, and the economic value of their labor generally belonged to their owner. That does not mean enslaved workers never possessed money or personal resources. Some could receive small allowances. Some were permitted to earn or save money. Some eventually purchased their freedom, but these possibilities depended heavily on individual circumstances. Freedom was not something they could simply demand, it was something controlled by others. For free workers, the situation was different, but life was still difficult. A laborer might be paid in coins, or receive food, or accommodation, or some combination of these. A skilled craftsman could earn more than an unskilled laborer. A person with specialized knowledge might find opportunities that were unavailable to someone whose only resource was physical strength. But even a reasonable wage did not guarantee comfort. The cost of living mattered. Food had to be purchased. Clothing required money. Housing could be expensive. Families needed support. Illness could interrupt work. An injury could become a financial disaster. For the poorest workers, there was little protection. Imagine a laborer who works every day. He earns enough to survive. Then, one morning, he becomes sick. He cannot work. No money comes in. The next day, he is still sick. Now there is less food. The problem grows. This was the fragile reality faced by many people living close to poverty. Work was not simply about earning money. It was about maintaining survival, and some jobs were worth more because they required skill. A trained craftsman could command a better income. A specialist might be respected, but the people performing the empire's most miserable jobs were not always the best paid. A worker who cleaned sewers did something essential, but society did not necessarily reward that importance with wealth. A person carrying heavy cargo might perform exhausting labor from morning until evening, yet the value of the goods could be enormous compared with the small amount earned by the person who moved them. This created a strange imbalance. The empire became richer, while many of its workers remained poor. A wealthy Roman could own land, invest in businesses, own property, or receive income without performing physical labor. Meanwhile, the worker could spend his entire day lifting, digging, carrying, baking, cleaning, or farming, and still have little left at the end. The difference between these lives could be enormous. Imagine a wealthy household at night. A family sits comfortably, oil lamps illuminate the dining room, food is served, servants move quietly. Outside the walls, someone is still working. Perhaps a porter is carrying goods. Perhaps a watchman is walking the streets. Perhaps a baker is preparing tomorrow's bread. The wealthy person may never see the connection, but the comfortable life depends upon the labor of others. This was true throughout Roman society. The empire's wealth did not exist separately from its workers. It was built through them, and yet, money was not the only form of payment. For some people, there were other rewards. A skilled worker could gain independence. A soldier could receive benefits. A successful merchant could become wealthy. An enslaved person might eventually become free. A worker might save enough to open a small business. Human lives were not always fixed in one position. There were paths upward, but those paths were narrow, and many people never reached them. For the majority of workers, life remained a cycle: work, eat, sleep, work again. Perhaps the greatest lesson is that Roman society was not simply divided into rich and poor. There were countless levels between them, and people could move through those levels. But the distance between the top and the bottom remained vast. The most difficult jobs often fell to those with the fewest choices. People who could not afford to refuse, people who needed food, people who had debts, people who were enslaved, people who had been born into circumstances they did not choose. And so, when we look back at the miserable jobs of ancient Rome, we should be careful not to imagine every worker as hopeless. Some found friendship, some built families, some learned skills, some gained freedom, some even became prosperous, but for countless others, the reward was simply another day of survival. And perhaps that is the quiet truth beneath all the grand monuments. Rome was magnificent. But magnificence has a cost. Someone had to pay it, not always with gold, often with labor, with exhaustion, with years of life, and sometimes with the simple sacrifice of being forgotten. Now, our journey is almost over. The streets are quiet, the fires have become embers, the markets are empty, and the workers we have followed are finally resting. Soon we will leave ancient Rome behind, but before we do, there is one final question. When the monuments fade, when the emperors are forgotten, when the stones themselves begin to crumble, what remains of the people who built everything, perhaps more than we think? The city is finally quiet. After all these hours, the streets of Rome have begun to settle beneath the darkness. The markets are empty, the carts have stopped moving, the harbor is still, the great public baths have cooled, the ovens have gone dark, and one by one, the workers we have followed throughout our journey have disappeared into the night. The baker has finished his work, the farmer has returned from the fields, the dock worker has set down his final load. The messenger has finally reached his destination. The night watchman has gone home. Somewhere, a household servant is sleeping in a small corner of a busy home, and somewhere else, perhaps far beyond the city, a road builder has placed his tools beside the unfinished road. Tomorrow, they may all begin again, but tonight, for a few quiet hours, the empire can wait. It is easy to look at ancient Rome and see only its grandeur, the enormous temples, the marble statues, the triumphal arches, the emperors, the armies, the wealth, the magnificent cities that still capture our imagination after nearly 2,000 years. But beneath all of that was something much simpler: people, ordinary people, people who woke before sunrise, people who carried heavy loads, people who worked underground, people who cleaned what others did not want to touch, people who stood beside burning furnaces, people who crossed endless roads, people who remained awake while everyone else slept. Their names have mostly disappeared. Their faces are unknown. We do not know what many of them dreamed about. We do not know what songs they sang while working. We do not know what they whispered to one another at the end of a difficult day. History rarely preserved those details. But perhaps that is exactly why they are worth imagining, because when we think about the past, we often imagine famous people. We see emperors standing on balconies, generals returning from distant campaigns, philosophers speaking in quiet gardens. We remember the powerful because their stories were written down, but the ordinary worker was just as real: the man carrying stone, the woman preparing food, the child helping with a family trade, the farmer watching the sky, the laborer waiting for a day's payment, the servant standing quietly at the edge of a room. These people were not background characters in their own lives. They had hopes, they had fears, they loved someone, they worried about something. They probably laughed, they probably became frustrated, and sometimes, despite everything, they were happy. Perhaps a worker returned home to find a warm meal waiting. Perhaps a farmer watched his children playing near the edge of a field. Perhaps two exhausted laborers shared a joke after a long day. Perhaps a servant found a moment of peace beside a fountain. These small moments were never carved into marble, but they mattered. And perhaps the most comforting thing about studying history is realizing that people in the distant past were not so different from us. They also became tired. They also wanted security. They also hoped tomorrow would be easier than today. They also looked toward the future without knowing what it would bring. The Roman Empire eventually changed. Cities declined. Buildings collapsed. Roads disappeared beneath grass and soil. The people who once filled the streets became memories, yet their work remained. Some roads still follow ancient routes. Some walls still stand. Some bridges still cross rivers. And beneath modern cities, fragments of Roman life continue to wait in the darkness. The workers themselves are gone, but the evidence of their hands remains. Perhaps that is the strange mystery of history. We think the past disappears, but it does not completely disappear. It leaves traces, a worn stone, a broken tool, a forgotten inscription, a road beneath a modern road, a piece of pottery buried beneath the earth. And sometimes, those small things are enough to remind us that someone was there. Someone touched that object. Someone carried that stone. Someone walked that road. Someone stood beneath the same sky. And perhaps, on a quiet night like this one, they looked upward and wondered about the future. They could not have imagined us. They could not have imagined modern cities, glowing screens, distant machines, or people listening to their story nearly 2,000 years later. And yet, here we are, still curious, still wondering, still trying to understand what life was really like for the people who came before us. So tonight, as you lie comfortably wherever you are, perhaps remember those forgotten workers, not as symbols, not simply as miserable people, but as human beings, people who lived entire lives within the enormous story of Rome. Their work was difficult. Their choices were sometimes limited. Their rewards were often small, but they lived, they endured, they built, they carried, they cleaned, they grew food, they moved goods, they kept the empire alive. And then, like every generation before and after them, they became part of the past. The streets of Rome are silent now. The ancient fires have gone cold. The footsteps have faded. The voices have disappeared. But somewhere beneath the quiet, the old empire still seems to whisper. Not the voice of an emperor, not the voice of a general, but the voice of the ordinary worker, the forgotten person whose name history never recorded. And perhaps that is the final mystery. If so much of Rome was built by people whose names we will never know, how much of our own world is also being built by people we never notice? The roads beneath us, the food on our tables, the buildings around us, the quiet systems that make ordinary life possible. Who are the people standing behind them? And when our own time becomes history, will anyone remember them? Will anyone remember us? Or will the future, like we do with ancient Rome, see only the monuments and forget the hands that built them? Perhaps we will never know, but tonight, you can let that question remain unanswered. The empire can wait, the roads can wait, the markets can wait. For now, there is nothing left to carry, nothing left to build, nothing left to clean, nothing left to prove. So take one slow breath, and let the distant streets of ancient Rome fade into darkness. Let the old stone roads disappear beneath the moonlight. Let the voices of the markets grow quiet, and as you drift toward sleep, remember that history was never made only by the people whose names survived. It was also made by the countless forgotten souls who simply woke up, went to work, and carried the world forward. Good night, and perhaps, when you close your eyes, you may wonder what other forgotten stories are still waiting beneath the dust, quietly sleeping, until someone, someday, remembers to wake them.